Anytime you start something new, one of the things that makes you anxious is, well, I don't know what I don't know. And so today we're bringing on somebody who's got 400 episodes under his belt and a history in radio. Matt Cundill from the Sound Off podcast is going to share some insights after 400 episodes. Hit it, ladies.
The School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson.
Podcasting since 2005, I'm your award-winning Hall of Fame podcast coach, Dave Jackson, thanking you so much for tuning in. If you're new to the show, this is why I help you plan, launch, grow, and if you want to, monetize your podcast. My website is schoolofpodcasting.com. If you use the coupon code LISTENER when you sign up for either a monthly or yearly subscription, you'll save a little bit. And of course, while you're out at the website, schoolofpodcasting.com, check out episode 933. That was last week's episode where we talked to all of you, the audience, and said, are you using YouTube? And if so, what are you using it for? And of course, you can get all the episodes by going to schoolofpodcasting.com/follow. So as I said, Matt Cundill has 400 episodes and a history. He's been in radio for a long time. And so I wanted to bring him on to pull that information out of his head so you can benefit. Here's my interview with Matt Cundill from the Sound Off podcast. Everything we talk about will be out at schoolofpodcasting.com/934. You can find him on the podcast Superfriends. You can find him on You May Also Like. But today we're talking about the Sound Off podcast because he just put out episode 400. Matt Cundill, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
400 episodes. When you started this, did you picture this going on for 400 episodes?
No, I didn't really know. I just wanted to get the first one done.
Yeah.
And it took me 11 hours to actually it took me about 8 to 11 hours somewhere in there to get about 23 minutes of audio done. And the interview was done over the telephone. And I had, a piece of equipment left over from a radio station to allow me to record the caller, and we had to figure out what to do with it next. And from that was episode 1. I was just hoping to get through one. And then once I did one, I did another.
That's really the best strategy. I know some people that start off, they're like, I'm going to do 10 or I'm going to do 100 and see what it does. They kind of put a stake in the ground, like, okay, we'll take our pulse at, episode 20 or something like that. Did you have anything like that?
I think it's kind of like when you're, 8 years old and you get a lighter and then you start a fire in the back alley and then you throw some crud on it. And that's what I thought I would do. I said, well, what happens if we do this? And what happens if we add something else? And what happens if we try it this way? I had a lot of time on my hands. I was restructured out of radio in 2014. 10th anniversary of that is actually coming up. And, I did some radio consulting for a bit. And, that space is very full, especially with, people like, James Cridland, who was doing it at the time, Jacobs Media, Valerie Geller, a lot of radio consultants out there. I did pick up some radio work in Canada, and I went in 2016 down to the Conclave in Minneapolis, which is a gathering of Midwestern radio people. But I just started a podcast, and I said, I really like what I see here. It's great to see Midwestern radio folk. And if I could only bottle this and take this home, well, I did. And I took it home, and I thought we could do a podcast talking about some of the things that were at a radio conference every week. So from that, the podcast was born.
Excellent. And I know you brought a list from 400 episodes. You have 12 things we can learn from, or things you've learned in those 400 episodes. So let's start off with number 1.
Can't do it alone. So, I got through those first few episodes. They sounded good, but it didn't sound good. It, when I played it in the car, it didn't sound full. It didn't sound like the radio, really. And when it came, I don't really know enough about mixing. I didn't have a lot of experience, cutting and, cutting audio together. I hadn't done that as a program director. That's something that my producer had done. So I called the producer at the radio station that where I was working before. And I said, I need some help. And I want it to sound a particular way, and I want it to sound full, and I want to listen to it in the car like it's the radio. And from there, since episode 4, Evan has been producing every episode of the Sound Off podcast since.
Yeah, I know one of the things I really appreciated is I was on episode 400, and the minute I started listening to it, I was like, oh, Matt has an editor, because I am an machine, and I had listened to 3 or 4 minutes and had not said and yet, and I was like, oh, he has an editor. This is so beautiful, which makes me want to share it more for anyone that ever interviews me in the future. So anybody else on your team that you go, wow, I don't know if they weren't here, this would have been a lot harder.
Yeah, we added people on as we went. So I did all the editing through episode 265. And then I realized I'm busy. I'm actually helping people with other podcasts now. And so I started to let other people edit it from that point. So 265 forward, other people were editing it. But as the podcast grew, we started to get into video. So we hired Christy. Christy does the video, and as well, Aiden does the editing and Evan does the production. So it's a team of 3 really that attack this every week.
Well, tip number 2.
SoundCloud's a terrible place to host your podcast. And, people are, I said, we're going to throw some crud on it. And it's, this fire's not burning properly. Why does this episode have 5,000 downloads? And then this one only has 500. And why does this one have 50? And Mark Ramsey, who's also a radio consultant who was a guest on the show, said, well, SoundCloud's a horrible place and it's all full of bots. And I said, really? I didn't know that. And so we had to get it out of there as quickly as possible. Run like Mexican water through a Canadian tourist.
I was actually at an event this week and somebody brought up SoundCloud, and I go, just let me give you one stat. I go, Apple changed their categories back in 2017. And SoundCloud hasn't updated them yet. I go, that's, 7+ years at this point. Is that really where you want to host your stuff? So yeah, great lesson. What's number 3?
So this one came from going to Podcast Movement. And I should preface that 2 weeks after I went to the Conclave in 2016, I went to Podcast Movement. And that's really where I got the bug. I said, oh, there's a whole industry here. And there's a guy named Dave Jackson. He's got a school of podcasting and stuff is happening and people have microphones. But it was a year later in Anaheim that Aaron Monkey from Lore was talking about the power of releasing episodes consistently. And, I spent some time saying, okay, I'm going to start to do that. And when I started to release episodes consistently, the downloads went up by 20% because people knew when to expect it. And shame on me for not knowing this, but it also taught me a lesson about radio. That your favorite radio station, your favorite host is starting at a particular time every day. At 6 a.m., you're probably getting the news, sports, weather. You know that traffic and weather together, traffic on the ones, whatever it is, radio conditions people into their habits. And as podcasters, I know we like to sit back and go, oh, well, I can just release this whenever. Well, your audience, you want to be part of their media ecosystem. You do have to be consistent. And I think Aaron told a story about people waiting around the campfire for the show to be downloaded and then just waiting 3, 2, 1, and it comes down at a particular time. Once you can be consistent, you can really own a piece of someone's media's pie.
Yeah, you become part of their routine. I know I have shows that I listen to that come out on Friday, and by 2, 3 o'clock, there it is. And I'm like, okay, cool. I know what I'm doing tonight. So what are your thoughts on seasons?
Yeah, I'm kind of split on seasons. So I'm a no for seasons because I have the ability to get ahead. So recently I went to Spain. I don't want to be recording people while I'm in Spain. So I do about 6 or 7 of them, and then I disappear for 6, 7 weeks, into the vortex of vermouth wine, Tito de Verano, and tapas. But the episodes are there, and we will put them out consistently. But I try not to knock anybody who wants to take a break. I think a lot of people do need to take a break in some capacity. But one of the things that they make a mistake on is that they don't tell their listener when they're coming back, and they don't tell anybody who might find their podcast, oh, this person hasn't released an episode in 6 weeks. I think you have to leave some messages behind about when you're coming back, and you really do have to stick to it. And I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to take a break, I'm not going to do anything. But you should probably stay active on your social media just to say, hey, coming up in September, we're coming back with 3 brand new episodes, and I want to tell you about it. There's ways to keep your audience engaged and as well take a break at the same time. Yeah, absolutely. All right, lesson number 4. I got a sponsor after episode 20. Wow. And yeah, it was great. And so, but there was a problem with it. And the problem with the sponsor was it was a Canadian company, but half the audience is American. And I thought, well, it's kind of like when I listen to a US based podcast and they're selling me US stamps, and I don't need to buy US stamps. And so it's kind of a waste of time. And so dynamic audio insertion or dynamic ad insertion became the solution to that. So, and at the same time, it was an excuse to get off SoundCloud. So we moved it over to Art19 and we started to use their dynamic ad insertion. And what happened after that was a year later, it was the same ad spot was sold to an American company. So now I was being paid twice with 2 sponsors for the same ad spot.
Gotta love that.
It was great. So the American audience got Promo Suite, which is a software for radio stations. And in Canada, it was a data company, Enlogic, who wanted to sell data to Canadian radio stations. And I thought, wow, this dynamic ad insertion is great.
Now, did you go find the sponsor? Or did they come and find you?
They called me and they found me. And then the other time it was at, the Conclave, again, another the radio conference that I'd gone to again. And they liked the podcast and wanted to be a part of it. And we found a way for them to be a part of it too. Nice.
Yeah. Do you remember, without making you would you consider your audience small, medium, large at that point? Or because 20 episodes in is not a lot.
I always looked at the show as being consistently around 2,000 some odd downloads after the first year. And it's always been that way. It's a radio audience, right. We've gotten to 3,000 from time to time. And we actually, in all of our metrics are, by the way, published OP3. So if you went to OP3, you can go and see what the downloads are.
I was going to say we were about the same boat, and then the Apple haircut kind of took care of some of that. It's
Yeah. And, over the years, by the way, there have been a few haircuts. So one of the ones was just moving simply from SoundCloud to Art19. That caused a little bit of a haircut.
Oh, yeah.
But because I have a background working as a program director, I've been working with numbers for years and look at the numbers and saying that's the audience, and then being able to build on those numbers. So I came really pre-built for this. And I think, when I got let go from radio, I was like, what am I going to do? What am I good for? And it turns out that I was more than my resume. And then once I found out, oh, there's metrics here in podcasting. Oh, look at these numbers. Oh, there's the user agent. There's the downloads. There's the geography. Oh, I can figure this out. So because I've been working with ratings data for so long that, it just came second nature to me to figure out what to do.
Lesson number 5.
So going back to the beginning when I said that I wanted it to sound like radio.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big mistake. That's no good.
Come on, what's wrong with that?
Exactly. So if you listen to the early episodes, and I'll never take them down because I think they're a great moment in time, but there's a lot of talking at the audience. It's a little bit loud. I was even saying things, talking about podcasting to radio people and saying it's a headphone experience and you want to talk to the audience and not at the audience. And even though I was saying it, I still didn't have it in full practice. So it was Jeff Schmidt, who works at Wondery. He does the production for a lot of the Wondery podcasts. And he took me aside nicely. I think we were in a bar in Philadelphia at Podcast Movement. He said, it's just too loud and it's over compressed and it's a difficult listen. And so I had to sit down again with my producer, who only knows radio anyway. And we said, okay, we need to make this sound like a real podcast. We need to look at what the standards are for putting out a good podcast, normalizing somewhere around -3, making sure the lofts are at about, -16, -15, -14 in that area.
Yeah.
And making sure that it's a good headphone experience for everybody.
Excellent. Number 7.
Artwork really matters. Yeah. So a couple of things about artwork, and I'm still to this day playing with it, but having artwork for for your show, for each episode, really matters. And it's about people. It's a people podcast, and put the picture of the guest up there. And I think as Spotify and Amazon Music began to include that, and now Apple's including it as well, it's more important than ever to make it look like you've got a variety of guests, to make it look colorful, to make it look like when you're scrolling. When I see, just show artwork for every episode, it tells me in the back of my head, every episode's going to sound the same. Now I know that that's not true,
right?
But visually, it's telling me I think every episode's going to sound the same. And the other one was just about show artwork. I don't know how we got here, but at some point, everything had a microphone in it. All I can think about is the only reason why artwork has a microphone in it is because that's what we tell people at Fiverr, make me podcast artwork. And they don't know anything about podcasts, but they know it makes a microphone. So here's your microphone with your artwork. And I mean, you don't see Steven Spielberg putting a movie reel in the bottom corner of his movie posters. So I don't know why as podcasters, there's microphones in there. I had a microphone in it. I took it out, and I've been playing a little bit with the artwork ever since. And, you know, when people say what makes good artwork, I think of the Fleetwood Mac album cover, think of the Boston album cover, think of vinyl. Maybe a lot of people can't do that because they're not old enough to know what that era was like. But other people, I think, also make the mistake of thinking that it's like a book and they put too much writing on it. And, you know, it's a 57 by 57 thumbnail in the phone. So I don't know what writing you're expecting me to be able to read. I just started wearing glasses. So it's just not going to be possible.
Because the problem is we're designing it when it's 3,000 by 3,000, which is the size of your head. And then, and I always love the fact that, you know, they put their name at the bottom and all this other stuff. And you're like, what you need is the name of the show in giant letters with maybe some sort of graphic that helps explain what it is. So and please don't do it in crayon. If your show artwork looks, unless it's a kid's, you know, show, but if your artwork looks like it was done in Microsoft Paint, it's if your artwork is done in crayon, then does that mean the rest of the podcast is done in crayon? I'm like, I just don't do that, please. Number 8.
So this actually goes back to the podcast that we recently did, and it really comes to video. And I've been really trying hard over the last, 8 months to really sort of come up with, a standard answer for video. And I think the answer is do video if you can, but you don't have to do video. I like doing video now that I've started to do it and get a little bit of a workflow. But, I'm a Gen X radio person. We did not have cameras in the control room. We were never comfortable with cameras. That was sort of across the hall for the people who did TV. And look at me now. I'm on your show and there's a camera and I'm getting used to it. It's just one of these things, one of these habits you have to learn to get into it. Really to what you said, and what I think is really what you said is that if you can do it, great. If you can't do it, you don't have to sell the whole farm just because it's, not in your wheelhouse.
More tips are coming up with Matt, but did you notice the mistake? Yeah, there was a mistake in this episode, and I'll tell you what it is right after this.
Yeah.
So the mistake was we went from tip number 5 to tip number 7. And when we last heard from Matt, he was talking about tip number 8. And for some reason, when I hit play on this, we start off with this, lesson number 10. So I had these written down. What I didn't do was put a number next to them. So we've learned through osmosis here, if you're going to do a numbered list, you might want to write the numbers down. Here's number 10 or 9 or 8, depending on how you're counting.
Transcription, I think it's still a pain. I have it listed as transcriptions, a necessary pain in the ass. It just takes time to go through it and to make sure that it's right. Probably of all the jobs that I have to do to get a podcast ready to go, transcription's the one that I loathe the most. That's the one where I have to just go through just to make sure all the words are right, the names are spelled right, and it really does reflect what it is. And of 400 episodes, I've had one request for a transcription. It was before I was doing transcription. It was 2018. Transcription wasn't readily available to us the way it is now. And I think at one of the podcast evolutions, I pushed back at James Cridland and Rob Greenlee, who were talking about the value of transcription. And I said, this is a time waster and it's also costly. And I'm not sure I have the time for it. To which James Cridland sort of snapped back. You, of all people, would have the ability to monetize that. Transcription of the show is brought to you by. And I said, aha, we will contra the transcription, which we did. And we contraed it with a company that out of Hong Kong that went broke. And when it went broke, it took all my transcriptions and died with it. So that was sad because they had a great embed tool. But when the company went broke, the transcription went with it, which was too bad. So I went and got another company, this time out of Cyprus, and it also went broke. And so here we are. We were like a year into doing transcription. We didn't have a lot to show for it. We had these embed codes on our website that all went dead. At which point we said, well, who's not going to go broke? And that answer is Otter. And so we've been stable and steady ever since.
Lesson number 11.
So the sponsorship opportunities that were out there, because there was a point where it got full, and a lot of podcast hosts offer inventory management for that. But you just at some point you just run out of inventory, and maybe you still have some sponsors that you need to do. But to what James Cridland said, you could have your transcription service sort of sponsored. You can have it's more than just mid rolls and pre rolls. You've also got space on the website that you can do it. You can also create a little spot before you jump into the full show, where you can thank people and give an additional mention to those sponsors. Also, if you have a show promo that you're swapping out, you can mention that our show is brought to you by something. I know that might ruffle a few feathers for anybody that you're doing a promo swap with, but if you let them know that our show is sponsored and we're going to mention it if we do a promo swap, I think they would appreciate that sort of heads up. But there are lots of opportunities out there just beyond, I've got a mid-roll and a pre-roll and a post-roll, and that's it. No, you've got a lot more. And so if you just take a look around, you'll be able to find some more spots to get some more sponsors.
A great show that does an excellent job at this is the Stacking Benjamin show with Joe Saul-Sehy, because he's got like the such and such lifeline and the call-in numbers, like everything. He once made a joke, and I was like, that's actually not a bad analogy, that he's kind of like NASCAR. He'll slap a sticker on anything. And I was like, that's a good way to go. Lesson number 12.
Yeah, this one goes back actually to episode, or it's early on. It's like episode 9, I think, where it was Jessica Rhodes, who does Interview Connections.
Yeah.
I wanted her on the podcast, or I wanted to have a call with her actually, but I found she had a booking tool. And so we have things like Calendly. I can't remember the one I used with you today. I used Schedule once, but these are great. This solves a bunch of problems, including time zones. People can now book in when I'm actually available to podcast with them. We can get a bounce back for people to, with the connection points, warnings, reminders. So many people come to me and they say, I need a chase producer. I need a guest booker. It takes so long to do this. And yes, you can go back and forth with lots of emails, and it can get even more complicated if you've got multiple people that you need to schedule. But I went through this exercise once and I paid it right away, and I bought Schedule once, and now super easy. I'd love to have you come on my show. Here's the link. Love to have you join. Pick a time that works for you, and I'll be there.
I use TidyCal. I've used Acuity Scheduling, which was later bought by Squarespace. And I just like TidyCal because it was like $40 lifetime deal. And I'm like, done. What's the biggest thing you think has changed since you've started in terms of like how you do the show?
Oh, just how easy it is now. I mean, I think we started with a phone box.
Oh man. JK Audio. I have one of those in the closet. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why we did that was I was thinking maybe we would have radio executives on who would call in and who would only have a landline. And as well, I'm in a basement and I don't want to patch people in on a cell phone. It's really been the technology, and especially when we hit the pandemic, the ability to, link cameras up, to record on either side. It used to be like, let's do a double ender. And boy, that got rid of the double enders quick once we had, tools like we're using now. And then StreamYard came along, and then Squadcast and Riverside and all this stuff. The technology is now there and has made it just so much easier. I mean, if you think back to anybody who had to start in 2017, there was a much, much bigger hill to climb.
I know with your 25 years of radio and now the podcast, if somebody said, what's the biggest difference between radio and a podcast? Like, are there pros and cons to each?
Radio is still live. It's done best when it's local. It's easily accessible. You get in the car and it's just there. They've got music, and it's also free. So all those sort of things wrapped up together really gives radio a very strong advantage. Podcasting, it's nice. You can put it in your pocket. You can take it with you on an airplane. It's your ecosystem, and it's customizable more than anything. So I guess those are really the two differences. When I started the podcast, it was really about, let's see if we can find the intersection between where radio and podcasting meet. And I thought they would really, intersect and collide into one another. And they really haven't. Aside from just taking your radio show and then plunking it into, catch-up radio and doing some on-demand stuff like after the show, it really hasn't sort of intersected as strongly as I thought it would. And I think that's fine. And I still look at it as being sort of audio in two piles. One is live and now, and the other one is on demand. So one is sort of like a network TV show like NBC, ABC, CBS, and the other one's a little bit like Netflix where you like sort of on demand. But now look, now Netflix is doing some live stuff, and you can do a live podcast and it can be on Fountain. So, because I've heard some live shows appear on Fountain. So it's getting closer. And I think probably within the next 5 years, we'll see, grow even closer together.
Well, we've mentioned the technology and you just mentioned Fountain. So I know I voiced my opinion on your show. What is your opinion of the whole podcasting 2.0 movement?
I think it's a cultural one. And I think a lot of people are like, well, how do we get more people into it? The only way to get more people into it is to talk about it and to let people know. So on all of my shows, I always tell people that we support podcasting 2.0. If you're using an app, you can send us a boost. And if you don't have an app that does that, go to get a new one right now at newpodcastapps.com or podcasting2.org. Thank you. And I'm the voice of that. I actually voice that. So, and by the way, any podcaster who wants those IDs, I've created the IDs. You can have them. They're for free. And you can use those, a male voice and a female voice, if you just want to use that piece of imaging for your particular podcast because you support podcasting 2.0.
There you go. And it sounds something like this.
This podcast supports podcasting 2.0. So feel free to send us a boost if you are listening on a new podcast app. Find your new app now at podcasting2.org/apps. That's podcasting2.org/apps.
You also have, now you have your podcast at soundoffpodcast.com. I'm sorry, is it .com or .ca? I should know this.
Both, actually.
Look at you, Mr. Smarty Pants. I love that.
So if you put in soundoffpodcast.ca, it will reroute to soundoffpodcast.com.
There we go. Now you also have those soundoff.network. Tell us a little bit about the network.
For anybody who's come to me and wants some help. So they, maybe they start out, they're looking to grow. What are some of the things we can do? Maybe they hit a particular point in their podcast where they want to have ads. Well, we can do that for you. Maybe they just want to sell their own stuff because they've got a podcast and they want to sell yoga tights out of their basement. Well, we can help you with that. We'll help you build, your dynamic audio insertion more than anything. So it is a network. And so for years I was like, oh no, it's not really a network. It's just a group of podcasts that are together. And it was Matty Stott who said, do you run promos between these shows? And I said, yes. And he goes, well, congratulations, you have a network. And so cross promos is another way that we want audiences to grow. It's a bit of a community. We have a Slack channel. People can come in and share ideas, hacks, and as well appear on each other's shows.
With your radio background, I would love to get your opinion on this. On one hand, if I just happen to come to a natural kind of stop, right? You have that kind of verbiage. Do you have an opinion on how to switch from content to ad?
I mean, there's no way to tell anybody that the baby's ugly and commercials are coming up, really more than anything. But I can go back to 1992 and I had a program director tell me, don't say, we'll be back because we never go away. And so there are little things that can be said that really drive a program director nuts. The one that really makes me crazy these days is when somebody on the air is trying to say, hey, coming up in 9 minutes, we're going to be doing this. I'm going to tell you about this particular thing that Donald Trump just did. Well, that's useless because it's going to take me about 9 seconds for me to Google what he just did. So I don't know what exactly you're hoping that I'm going to stick around for. Even worse, hey, coming up right after the break, we're going to give you your weather forecast. Well, that's ridiculous because I can get that from Siri with just a few words. So there are some pockets of radio that haven't really caught up or figured out how to do it. And if there's really a right way to do it, in the end, it's commercials and radio commercial breaks are way too long. They can go 6 minutes. They can go 7 minutes, way too many units sold at too low a price. And I think that's why podcasting is done so well is that, 1 or 2 mid-roll ads per half hour. We're not really sure what the magic number is, but somewhere in there is a nice trade-off for some content. To this point, though, podcasters are still guilty of this as well. And I hear this all the time. The show is winding down. And usually the host will say, well, we're just about to wrap up here in just a sec. Just before I let you go, one last question before we end this. These are all signals that the show is coming to an end. You are actually inviting the listener to leave and giving them an option. Just ask the last question and have the show end. You don't want to tip off that we're wrapping this up. I got to go. Someone's got to go. We're in a hurry. You're actually causing anxiety to the listener. And when the minute you do that, you're actually cueing the listener in their mind to go and, oh, what's the next piece of content I'm going to have to go find?
Yeah. What's next in the queue? What happens if I click next? That's interesting. Well, you've interviewed a lot of people. Do you have any tips for the person that's starting out with podcasting and they want to do interviews? You've done a ton. What are some quick tips to help them do it right?
I have done 400 plus podcast interviews, but before I was the music director at a radio station, and the bands would have to come by, and my job was to interview the bands. And sometimes I don't know the bands, and maybe I don't like the bands. They're new. How am I going to make this entertaining? So I've been interviewing for a very, very long time. And the most important thing is to make sure that you plan accordingly. And by that, I think of Bill Parcells in football, 50% preparation, 50% execution. So do write out your questions. Don't feel the need to ask them all. Think of it more as sort of a roadmap to where you're going to go, and then listen back to how they're answering. And maybe while they're answering something, another question pops in your head. You need to have a pen with you at all times to write down that question. There you go. So you don't forget, that I want to ask about that. I want to ask about that. And maybe you'll turf another question, and then you'll ask one that you just scribbled down.
Favorite celebrity interview?
In podcasting?
Or music, because it sounds like you depending on when you were doing that, you probably had some fun 80s.
Mick Jagger.
Yeah, that doesn't suck.
No, that was very good. Yeah, Mick Jagger. Albeit it was on the phone. Ozzy Osbourne in 1996. Before we had the Osbournes, we didn't know that he was like that wacky. Yeah. And so every question I asked him, he kept saying, "Well, I'm going to have to ask my wife Sharon." Well, that's a question for Sharon. I thought I was being smart by asking questions, but they were really all managerial questions. So every answer was, "Oh, you'll have to ask Sharon." And I was like, "Well, just put Sharon on the phone." I think with podcasting, and especially this one, I got to speak with my broadcast heroes. Mm-hmm. And, talking to Broadway Bill Lee, who in New York City is still in his 70s and is still, hitting the post and playing the hits on WCBS FM, interviewing Lisa Guerrero, because I loved watching the Best Damn Sports Show period on Fox. I used to watch that on satellite, and, knowing her career where she was on Monday Night Football for a year, and she's in Playboy, and now she works at Inside Edition, and just, hearing her story. So those are some of the favorite ones that I've got to dig into.
If you're in the middle of an interview and it's not going well, what's your strategy there? Because you did say it's 50% preparation, and you prep for somebody to, actually answer the questions, and something's gone wrong. Maybe if it's an old drunk musician, you never know. What's your strategy to okay, this is not going well? How do you pull yourself out of that?
Well, I think the first thing is when you do interview, I think a lot of people ask really long questions, and I think really long questions can really intimidate the guest. So try to ask short, succinct questions more than anything. And I find when you ask short, succinct questions, you don't get into this particular problem. But the nice thing is with podcasting, it's recorded. So if you don't like the way the answer came out the first time, maybe rephrasing the question and getting them to re-answer it without saying, "Oh, could you answer it a different way, or can you change it up?" Because that stuff will make them feel uncomfortable. Because you can ask the same question again, just in a different particular fashion. I think also when you start the interview, I think prefacing that, this is recorded, and anything you don't like, just go back and restart it, and we'll fix it up and clean it up for you later. I think that's a heavy burden that you take off their shoulders when you tell them that, it's not live and we're not on the radio. I remember the first time I went on the radio, I was 18. I was so nervous. And my first time I went on the radio as a DJ, I was so nervous. And people would come to the studio and they're so nervous because it's live and you can't do any of that stuff. So I think if you let them know that, yeah, this is recorded and we're going to be able to clean this up, it really takes a load off their shoulders.
The last week and a half, I've been just a tsunami of AI has been put in front of me. What are your thoughts on all of this automated stuff?
I think as a voice actor, I'm not too scared. I think the best part is it's going to, take out the bottom of the industry. So if you're on Fiverr, you're going to not get as much Fiverr work because I could just go use an AI voice. But there's still going to be a lot of work out there that's going to require a voice actor. And so if you are a voice actor, you've got to sharpen your skills. You've got to stay fresh. You've got to be versatile. You got to be practicing a lot. Try out some new characters. It's not just reading about, the corporate narration. There was somebody I think we work with in the industry here who went and got an AI voice. And I said, oh, I can tell that's AI. So if I can tell that's AI, I think you should probably go and get this other person to go and voice it and get something, warm and wonderful. Some of the most popular ads now, or at least in the past, has always been, voiced by a familiar actor. So Gene Hackman, did him for years.
John Goodman.
Sam
Elliott.
Josh Lucas does Home Depot. I mean, it's distinctive and it. And I think for, voice actors, if you're thinking about getting a voice, get a voice for your brand. I feel so good, when I, about using the people that I do, and I pay them as if it were radio. And that's the voice of my brand. I can't tell you how good it made me feel to go and do that instead of just using sort of a regular voice that you can get on Fiverr. And just fun fact, the person who is the voice of the Sound Off podcast is Tara Sands, and Tara Sands is a voice on Pokemon.
There you go.
Bulbasaur, I believe, is the character that she voices, as well as many, many other things.
You said work on your different characters. Like, how many characters do you have? Like, do you have like, can you do like serious Canadian about or like that's something I've never really thought of, but.
Yeah, you don't really think of it until the script comes back and say, are you Canadian or from Minnesota or North Dakota? Because you said about. It's one of the two that it sort of lands in there. I think one of the bigger discoveries I had was that I could have a very young voice. And when I became the voice of the Ontario Virtual School and I was reading, course lessons, and it's just sort of like 60 seconds or 2 minutes about what the course entails. Hey, kids, math is fun. And we want you to join the Ontario Virtual School. It was just a character that came out,
right?
And they said, okay, you're hired. And I was like, well, you wanted somebody, 20 years old. Apparently that voice worked. That's when you have to try out the character voice to see how it's going to land and see how you might get it. Yeah. And for anybody who wants to get in and be a voice actor, take some improv lessons. That's where it'll shine.
Was curious. I've never really delved into voice acting or voiceover or whatever you want to call it.
And one of the interesting ones that's sort of now come up is, companies will go and they'll say, can we get a radio ad? And the radio ad, then it's like, okay, we're going to put the radio ad on podcast. And it doesn't work because it's a radio ad for the radio. And so for podcasting, you could get a host read. And I think we're all familiar with how a host read ad will work. But now there's also announcer read. So frequently a company like Spotify will come to me or any other company. They say, could you read this as announcer read? And what they're really looking for is read this to podcast listeners. So they don't want the yelling and the screaming and the high production. They're really looking for somebody who is going to speak in a slower tone and deliver the message in a more conversational way. So there's sort of a whole little industry that has grown up off to the side of, in the voice acting world where they're asking for announcer read. And announcer read means earphone listening, personality, and conversational.
I mean, he's before my time, but I always think when I think of personality radio, I think of Wolfman Jack, baby, and there's no personalities in radio, at least during the morning, maybe, but the rest of it's been sucked out. So I've been telling podcasters, lean into your personality and your stories and things like that. Because A, ChatGPT doesn't have that. And B, it's, you're either going to endear yourself to your audience or, and those that don't like your personality won't listen, and that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, and I think of radio, and you mentioned you're in Ohio. I can get WMMS in my car. I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba right now. Yeah. And I am going to hear the ads, and the ads are going to be, your budget stretches further at Mattress Firm. That's not the way we would ever deliver that in the podcast world. And by the way, I was a voice of Mattress Firm for a while.
There you go. Yeah. WMMS, home of the buzzard. So that's always great fun. Well, congratulations, my friend, on 400 episodes. How many episodes do you know you have your other shows, the podcast Superfriends, and you may also do you know how many episodes of those you got?
Yeah, episode 23 came out today and by the way, this is a great story it started as the Hot Air podcast. We did a bunch of episodes and I thought it was, kind of lame after a while, and it didn't have direction and branding. So we changed it to You May Also Like. It's now a podcast recommendation podcast. and where I looked at, the work that Ariel Nissenblatt does with a newsletter, Earbuds Collective, which has podcast recommendations. I said, well, I should do a podcast that has podcast recommendations. So again, it's sort of an area for me to play. Podcast Superfriends, we get together. There's 5 of us. We're podcast producers. But we actually started to do a group meeting where we came together once a month just to talk about, hey, have you tried this new update with Squadcast? Have you tried this tool? Have you tried that tool? What's your experience? We would just share ideas. And eventually we should bottle this and put it out there. And I'm sure people will find this interesting. And yeah, there's some people out there who just want to make their podcasts better and they're looking for tips and tricks. And so we do it live. We put it live on StreamYard and then we put it into podcast form afterwards.
Excellent. Well, I will have links to all that along with the Sound Off podcast and Doug's voiceover and the network. Everything will be out in the show notes, which I will now tell you the number now. schoolofpodcasting.com/934. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
And thank you. Met you back in 2016. I couldn't believe there was a guy who's got a whole school involving podcasting. And I thought, this is the thing, and this is where I want to be. And it was sort of around that moment that there was going to be no turning back. I'm just going to do this podcast thing because it's awesome.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Soundoffpodcast.com is where you can find Matt. And of course, I'll have everything we talked about today out at schoolofpodcasting.com/934. Something he mentioned there about how you can get sponsors for different segments and such. Like, for instance, I always have the where am I going to be? I might want to see if Travelocity wants to sponsor that. Or if you're not doing a segment that can be sponsored, but you mention a company, be sure to tag them on social because that will put them or put you on their radar. Something else I wanted to point out here that if I could do it again, and this is under the category, because you may not have even noticed this besides the whole numbering thing, but something that I listened to and I went, and that is I corrected my guest. Not a huge deal, but when we were trying to remember podcasting 2.org and I said, oh, it's .org, I should have just said, hey, you know what? Go ahead and say that again. Again, not a big deal, but that was one. And then the other thing is we talked about way too long of questions, and I do that all the time. I give people a ton of information and then ask the question. And so I always take that out. But if you ever wonder what I'm talking about, here's one where I asked him, hey, tell us about your network, but I gave him all this behind the scenes stuff that you didn't need. And yes. I was like, wow, you have a network. And so is that just the people, because you do help podcasters, is that just the people you help, or is that actually a network where you're looking for similar shows? Or tell us a little. And that's where I cut that off, because that's where I actually got to the question. So for me, I do that a lot. I don't know if it's a bad thing. I'm giving the guest an idea of what I'm looking for in their answer, but I always cut that out because you don't need to know all that behind the scenes stuff. When I say, so tell us about your network, it's not like you're sitting there going, I wonder what Dave means by that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In case you missed it, it's time for a podcast rewind.
I was on the Rocky Mountain Marketing Show. That's hosted by Katie Brinkley. She's awesome. And we were talking about podcasting for business growth. And Katie asked me about, did podcasting boost my confidence as a speaker and as a teacher?
Do you feel like from going from behind the curtain and really holding the microphone changed a lot for your confidence as a teacher, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it was weird because when I was growing up, I actually was fired from my first job because I was too shy, and nobody believes that. I'm like, nope, you can talk to people. It happened. And then over the years, a friend of mine basically said, fake it till you make it. So pretend you're outgoing. When I started that, I was basically talking about how to, because it was for musicians, how to get more gigs and sell more CDs and things like that. But there was a guy named Bob Baker who is like the godfather of music marketing. And he had a huge newsletter. And I'm like, well, who am I? But what was cool is because I had a podcast, I was able to go to Bob Baker and go, hey, do you want to be on my podcast? And he's like, sure. I remember talking to him and I'm like, how did you become Bob Baker, godfather of music marketing? He's like, well, when I started my newsletter, I'd been playing in bands for a while. I had a marketing background. I had written for different newspapers. So I just kind of put them all together. He goes, I took out my magic wand and touched my head and said, you are now a marketing guru. I go, oh, okay. So it dawned on me that I was like, okay, I guess I'm a podcast expert. Thank you so much, Katie, for having me on the show. And yeah, like anything else, the more you do it, the more confident you get at it and the better you get at it. And I know I've been in places where people are like, hey, Jackson, get up there and say something. So I have no prep and I'm able to pull it off. So thanks to Katie. And also, Katie sent me this awesome metal water bottle that's like really, really cool. And it's got her Rocky Mountain Marketing logo on it. It's very cool. So thank you so much for that, Katie. Links to that will be out at schoolofpodcasting.com/934.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you haven't already, go to schoolofpodcasting.com/follow, and then you will get the episodes the minute they are available. And next week, I'm doing an episode, and I'm doing a deep dive. It's something we've talked about before, but I really wanted to, like, what does good content look like? But more importantly, what is good content that will help me grow my show and increase my audience? So I've spent quite a bit of time looking into this, trying to decipher. So this is more than my typical laugh, cry, think, grown, educate, or entertain. I wanted to take a deeper dive. So that is coming up. And if you go to schoolofpodcasting.com/follow, that allows you to follow the show in whatever your favorite app is. And of course, while you're out there at schoolofpodcasting.com, click on the sign up button, use the coupon code LISTENER, and save on either a monthly or yearly subscription. Get access to our tutorials, our unlimited, and I don't pawn you off on a team member, unlimited one-on-one coaching with me, and our awesome community. Use the coupon code LISTENER when you go to schoolofpodcasting.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. Until next week, take care. God bless. Class is dismissed. Matt Bundle. Very well done. It was so good till the end. Yeah. And also, Katie sent me this awesome cup thingy. What do you call that? It's a water bottle. There we go, Dave. That's what it is.